Hi everyone, my name is Genaro Fuentes, and I'd like to show you my presentation on how urbanization affects different habitats and animals and plant life's reactions to these urbanizations, and how we can lessen the impact of urbanization to all parties involved. So, in a nutshell, urbanization is the rapid shift of changing a rural open landscape into a commercialized and densely populated zone, and which would include buildings, highways, and overall, it would fragment the habitats and landscape. While this means spacing in houses and more access of resources for humans, this means habitat loss for animals, which are unfortunately forced, and they have no power in stopping this. And due to the forced displacement, this especially impacts habitat restricted species that may only be able to thrive in certain landscapes. Surprising though, urbanization can also lead to some corridors being able to be formed between different habitats. For example, we see here that while there's a highway between two habitats, there's also we decided to build a land bridge for any animals that would look to traverse between the habitat patches. And this is an old example of that. Previously in this class, we examined how a railroad can act as a corridor because of being an open space between two or more large dense areas of trees. First, I'd like to discuss the effects on animals for urbanization. Now, we know animals are cognitively aware and knowledgeable of shifts in their environment, but is it the same for human action? Is it the same for anthropogenic changes? So here we see a coyote tiptoeing over a wall, could be a fence, but pretty high off the ground. We don't see this activity occurring within nature at all. I don't think that. So we see that the animals will adapt to the changes in their environment um, to better suit their needs, especially. Now you may know that that some deers and some other land animals cross the roads and whatnot, but surprisingly, even when there are culverts available for them to use to traverse between these, they often don't take it. When over 50%, up to 50% of coyote mortalities come from road collisions, according to Tigas, Van Vieren, and Sauvajot in 2002. And this might come as a surprise because we know that these shortcuts are capable of helping them traverse through the dangerous highway. And we look to how animals change their behaviors. Now we know that generally speaking, most species would rather avoid animal contact. I mean, human contact, excuse me. And the data supports that actually, but oddly enough, coyotes are known to be more nocturnal animals and preferably hunt during nighttime. But when living in more urban areas, they actually tend to do most of their scavenging in the daytime. And while they still do tend to avoid human contact, they stay in the daytime so they can more easily have access to human food that are usually waste, such as garbages, or even just finding it off the road or in a park like we see here. Now, when it comes to changes in plant life, um, we know that plant pollination is a necess or is a necessity for our global ecosystem, for our global environment, and it's also a necessity for sustainable ecosystems locally. And we see here, and we know because of urbanization, more be because of urbanization cutting apart entire patches of habitats. Often it's almost inevitable that we lose a certain amount of biodiversity whenever we choose to open a landscape for human use. However, in urban zones, we can still find green areas which are often found in parks. There are often some greenhouses present in some urban areas, and some residents would create a garden in their backyards. And with that in mind, a study by Hennig and Gazel 2011 saw that um, as with nature, it's found that in urban zones, pollinators such as bees and saphids would prefer zones with more diverse and abundant plants to pollinate than they would of a rather low density and low diversity zone. And, and this study was done in Zurich, Switzerland, where the city itself is mostly composed of a large park, with some zones being of smaller and, well, frankly, farther away parks that where the study conducted, where it was easier for them to just simply for most pollinators to stay within one area where there was a great amount of diversity that they could sustain themselves with. Now, so we've discussed how animals are used to adaptation, but why is urbanization so much more destructive than things that they can adapt to easily? And the answer to that is the fact that urbanization is very rapid, and the fact that it's also an unnatural form of selection. Urbanization occurs sometimes within the same generation of some animals' lives, to the point where they can't adapt to such a change, both in behavior and in genetics, honestly. Without the ability to without the ability for them to change genetics to it, their offspring are just as incapable of adapting that change as they are. And so animals are often found confused by their environment and whatnot. But we saw earlier that behavior can and is capable of changing, but it's not always within the realm of possibility for some. And what makes this a form of unnatural selection is because of the fact that when humans urbanize, it's unknown whether we are destroying landscapes that are more that are more producing, or landscapes that are dying out. And what makes natural selection work is that the landscapes that aren't producing as much or as fast as they would be the ones to die out, and therefore um, that landscape may itself die out without our influence. But with our influence, we may be destroying landscapes that are thriving and would have continued to thrive if there was no outside force involved in that ecosystem. Now, let's ask ourselves, how do we reduce the harm of urbanization? Now, shown here are two elephants crossing a road, and in a study done by I believe it was Haddad 1999. No, it was Engel et al. 2005. In a study by them, they put trackers on elephants to track the effectiveness of their man-made corridors to avoid elephants from walking into an urban zone in South Africa. And, well, it was found that clearly animals prefer to go through elephants rather. We prefer going through wide open corridors for them. So, because as roamers and as nomads, as an animal, they um they would prefer not to be um squished together in a small corridor to avoid human contact. And what the premise of the study was, understanding the animals that they are working with, so that we can understand the least possible way for us to invade their lifestyles and continue to possibly cohabitate with them, and without the risk of destroying the biodiversity of the land that we are taking over. Urbanization itself it's not always a bad thing, because sometimes in the world of winemaking, we could be urbanizing a new zone, bringing in foreign roots, foreign plants, and possibly be thriving the biodiversity of that zone. But sometimes it's not always possible for everyone to come out the same. But it might be an inevitability, but we could always try to make that inevitability more sustainable and more friendly to our environment.